Welcome to our radio history event. We did something like this, very similar. We did this about 10 years ago, and Mike had a presentation, and David Jackson followed him with a local presentation, and we're going to do it again because we haven't done it, and this is our mission, to preserve this history, to present it, to record it, and do whatever we can to promote keeping radio alive. So we're going to have Mike Adams and Bart Lee and Len Shapiro, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who is going to address what you all are going to be doing and address the presentation, and he'll introduce Bart. Thank you.
Bart Lee is my longtime friend. I've known Bart. We've all known him for 20 or 30 or 40 years as C.H.R.S. has been around. Bart is our attorney. He attended and graduated from the University of Chicago, which really impresses me a lot. That's an impressive school.
It wouldn't be impressive if you've been there.
Yeah, well, but anyway, but Bart is a wireless expert, and even though the law is still his profession, we at C.H.R.S. do this sort of thing because we like to, and so Bart is going to do one of his many presentations on wireless. He has written articles about these in various journals, the AWA Journal, the C.H.R.S., and others, books, and he's written a book on gardening, on green gardening, which I read. And he also wrote a book on history of philosophy and that sort of thing, which I read 2/3 of, and I promised to read the last third. Anyway, Bart Lee is a man of many, many talents. I will turn this over to Bart Lee. How about a tittering of applause? Thank you. That's right.
Well, thank you, Mike. We'll go into the financial arrangements later for such a sterling introduction. What we're really starting to talk about is something that happened in the late 19th century. And that was sort of in the middle of the 19th century when James Clerk Maxwell figured out that you could use mathematics to understand something that he understood to be electromagnetic waves and things like that. So that was followed by Heinrich Hertz, a name that you've all heard and everybody respects. Hertz, who figured out that you could actually sort of transmit these waves that Maxwell had postulated from place to place. Now, he wasn't actually doing it more than about, 60 inches, but still, he was able to do it. So that stimulated a lot of thought about how to send signals, perhaps, and like how to listen to lightning flashes if they had electromagnetic emissions and things like that. And the main guy I will talk about today a little tiny bit is Marconi, and we all know about Marconi. Now, Marconi figured out that actually he had studied the work of Hertz as a very young man, about 19, with a professor by the name of Righi, and Righi was doing experiments based on what Hertz had done, and so Marconi figured that he could do this sort of thing too, because all he needed was a lot of wire and a coil and make sparks and things like that. He, among the number of experimenters, Pavlov and Lodge and any number of them, was very interested in actually sending signals that meant something, as opposed to ringing a bell at a distance to show their experimental prowess. So Marconi started to work on how to send signals at a distance. And he had a little spark transmitter, which is fairly simple. And we have an example from the C.H.R.S. archives of a spark transmitter, maybe 20 years after Marconi did his original work. So this technology moved pretty quickly. This is an amateur radio spark transmitter, I think probably from just before World War I. And it has a crystal detector, which we'll get to in a moment. So anyway, what Marconi was interested in is getting signals at a distance, how to get some distance, because he thought you could actually impress intelligence on these little sparky things and communicate. Now, there were already lots of ways to communicate. For example, you could send messages from London to New York by cable, but it cost in today's money about $400 a word to do that. Now, of course, ships at sea, once they left, well, they maybe got to port, maybe they didn't. If they got to port, they'd send you cable. And so a ship at sea was incommunicado, as we say. Well, what I want to turn to first is what was happening in San Francisco, because San Francisco had a great deal to do with the development of early wireless. It was going on around the world. It was going on in Germany and Austria. It was going on to some extent in Japan. It was going on in England, of course, with Marconi. It was even going on in Brazil as early as 1895. So this is the graphics are a presentation I did for AWA. And part of it is about a man by the name of Arthur Isbell, who came here and set up the big, giant transmitters up at what we call KPH now in Bolinas. And he came in 1912, 1914 to do that. So this is the story, wireless on the West Coast, 1899 to 1920 plus. This work on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in England and France and Germany was the foundation for broadcasting. And one of the primary reasons that broadcasting was able to take off was that there were so many people familiar with this technology before World War I and then during World War I, when so many people were in the military and the Navy using this technology, including the then new state-of-the-art vacuum tubes. That was the foundation for broadcasting that came as a magnificent fad about 1921. All right, so 1899, this is the lightship San Francisco, lightship 70. It was about, I don't know, 7 or 8 miles out in the fog. And its job, you can't see it very well. Well, maybe you can. There's a smokestack here. And what it had was, it had a steam whistle. And every once in a while it would blow this steam whistle. And the steam whistle must have been like 180 dB or something like that. And I can't imagine how anybody survived actually working on that ship. But anyway, that's what his job was, to be out there 24 hours a day blowing a steam whistle. Now, 1898, we had a war. We're always having wars, but this one was with Spain, and we won that one. And it was in part about what was going on in the Philippines. So there was a California regiment went to the Philippines and took care of business, and then came back on a troop ship. Now, because of cables, people knew the troop ship had left Manila, but of course they didn't know when it would get here. There was no way to know that, or if it would get here, actually. So what happened was, a couple of high school teachers found a Ruhmkorff coil, which was used for experiments, and it made big sparks. And these days, that coil over there in the little box is an automotive spark coil, but it does the same thing as a Ruhmkorff coil. It takes a little bit of signal and a little bit of voltage that alternating with a buzzer, and it steps it up way to high voltage. And that's what a Ruhmkorff coil does. So what they did is they convinced the newspaper that what it should do is pay for a Ruhmkorff coil out there at this lightship 70. This is 1899. And that way, find when the troops are coming home and get the scoop, because there was going to be a huge big party in San Francisco when the troops finally came home. So they're out there in the middle of the fog and, looking for things, and they're not seeing anything, and they're blowing the whistle. But all of a sudden, about 5 o'clock in, this August day in 1899, here comes the troop ship, which was the Army ship Sherman. And so they sent a signal, and the signal was in Morse code from the Ruhmkorff coil. And an antenna, which we get that graphic again, I'll show you, but a wire went up to the top, and we have this, that's Kent Leach, by the way, did this for us, and it looks like a bell at the top when we get to it again, but it's a capacity hat. It's not a real, like, hat-looking hat, but with wires and things, but we did it as a bell so we could show it. So they sent the signal, Sherman is sighted. And I know, Paul has had a lot of this historical stuff for many, many years, and that's what I used when I put this together. So the signal goes to the Cliff House, and it's received. And so it's then sent to the newspaper to shoot off fireworks and to start the presses rolling and stuff like that. And it goes by telephone. Well, what happened was, in those days, journalism was quite cutthroat. Somebody is tapped the telephone lines or, overheard the conversation or something. So the other newspaper actually got the scoop. But still, it was wireless, and it was the first transmission of intelligence in America. Marconi came in October and sent some signals around for the yacht races and things like that. But the first actual wireless in North America or South America in the Western world was here in San Francisco in 1899, which I always thought was very cool. So when this happened, there was enormous publicity, actually all over the country as a result of this. So there were many people in San Francisco and in other places, mostly young men, who thought, well, maybe I could do this. And so they started fooling around with this, state-of-the-art stuff. And it became, so we're talking 1901, 1902. Now, I can document that there were amateur radio operators in San Francisco in 1903. So that's a long time ago. Now, the Navy got very interested in this sort of communication, as you can imagine. So as early as 1904, there were naval stations on Yerba Buena Island and on Mare Island, and there were others. Not many, but there were others. So they had a little network. So in the 1906 earthquake, they were able to use this naval communication system to get signals through the Navy out to other places. All right, so yeah, all right, this is good. So this is one of those newspaper reports of 1899. Wireless telegraphy excites much interest, and indeed it did. This was a nationwide and actually worldwide story because of the press. So, but let me go back just a minute, because this is the Lightship 70, and you can see on the top, if you can, you see this is the capacity hat. So what you've got is you've got a wire going up there, which is really the antenna, and this is the capacity hat that permits it to resonate at a lower frequency. Now at the Cliff House, they had a wire going up as high as they could get it, and they had a little coherer detector, which is a very simple, very primitive way to capture wireless signals coming down. So that's how that worked. The first experiments were actually done, where we go? Oh, those are the two guys who did it. The original experiments were done from this building, which incidentally still exists. It's the old call building. It survived the fire and it's been fixed up, but it still exists. And those signals were sent in April of 1899 to Telegraph Hill, and they were received on Telegraph Hill. So that's about, I don't know, a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles at most. But there were a lot of streetcars in those days, and there still are now. And so there was a lot of interference from the streetcar sparks, so you couldn't really be sure that you weren't listening to a streetcar. So that's when they moved out. So that's the Cliff House as it looked in 1899, and that's where the signals were received. And this is the guy, Walters and McKissick. These are the guys who did it. So I think they deserve much praise, much historical praise. Now, this is a picture of Alcatraz Island. In 1901, the Army set up a circuit between Fort Point, which is at the very up by the Presidio, and Alcatraz Island. And the purpose of this was to control the artillery. What artillery? Well, from the time of the Civil War forward, it was believed that bad guys could come in the Golden Gate and steal all of California's gold. Now, in the Civil War, it wasn't like the Confederate Navy was going to do it, because they didn't have a Navy. But the British Navy was a significant issue, because they had the ability to get in the Golden Gate and come and basically conquer California. So in the Civil War, fortifications were built, one of which is under the Golden Gate Bridge. One is up in Marin, and it was triangulated with the apex at Alcatraz Island, so that any ships that came in would face serious artillery fire. And they didn't come, for whatever that's worth. All right, now, the first commercial wireless circuit was in Long Beach to Avalon on Santa Catalina Island. This was in 1902. And this was done by a company, Pacific Wireless, that I'll talk about later. So people saw the commercial possibilities here. There was no way. There was a cable to Santa Catalina, but again, it was very, very expensive. So the idea here was not so much to pioneer communications as to undercut the cable companies and steal their business. This is capitalism at its best. You know, move fast and break things, right? So that was the whole idea. Now here's a guy, Cranky. His name is A.J. Cranky. You can hardly see him here, but he's sitting there, you know, in the glow of his spark system, I'm sure, who was one of the operators there. Mariette became a very famous engineer later. But at the time, he was just beginning to do this sort of thing, and he's the guy who put the circuit into operation. So he really gets the credit for this circuit. Now, this is what it looked like out on Avalon, United Wireless Telegraph Company. That's a later 1912 picture. When they first did the Avalon circuit, it was the Pacific Company. Now, the Coast Guard picked up on this. In 1903, we had what was called the Revenue Marine in those days, because the government financed itself with taxes on things that came into the country. So there was enormous amounts of smuggling going on. There was hardly a cove on the west coast of the United States that wasn't used for smuggling, in the 19th century, and especially during Prohibition. So the Coast Guard, the predecessor of the Coast Guard, started putting wireless on its ships in 1903. So we're going back pretty far here, okay? This is well over a century. The Army set up all sorts of stations, particularly going up into Alaska. So that network was established as early as 1905. And this is station FK in Alaska somewhat later in 1909. Now remember, the same thing is happening in England, the same thing is happening in France, the same thing is happening in Germany and Austria and Italy. These networks are growing. They're military, they're naval, and they hope to be commercial. That was a great challenge, but they hope to be commercial. Now here in San Francisco, as early as 1902, a guy by the name of Francis McCarty started modulating a spark gap. So he took the spark gap and basically put a carbon microphone in the ground lead of the antenna. And he was able to actually modulate the spark gap and begin to get some intelligent voice out, intelligible voice out. So he was at age 14, he started doing this. He had a station out on Ocean Beach, and this was it, 1905. Here's an interior of the station. He's got a wireless telephone going. I don't know if you can see. That's a pretty tough graphic to make any sense of, but it's McCarty standing there holding one of those old telephones. And here he is, the boy inventor. God, it looks like he has a halo here. And he did. I mean, he was really widely respected. And he turned from the spark technology, which made for a very raspy signal if you're trying to modulate it with a microphone, to an arc technology. The arc had been put together by a Dane by the name of Paulson, and they came to San Francisco as early as 1907, became the foundation for Federal Wireless. But there were other people who could make arcs and did make arcs, including Doc Harold in 1912 through 1916. And so the arc came up, the arc made a very noisy, lousy, continuous wave signal. So you could modulate the arc much better, and you could actually transmit voice. And that's what McCarty was doing. McCarty got killed in in a motorcycle accident about 1906, and his brothers continued. Now, this is the Mare Island Naval Station in 1904, and we have here in the museum, we have a brass horn that was used at the Mare Island Naval Station just a little bit after this period. Now, there's a fellow by the name of Major Squire in San Francisco who later became Major General Squire and ran the Signal Corps in World War I for the United States Army in the European War. But in 1905, he got to play around because there was no wars going on. So he started using trees as antennas for wireless stations. It didn't work too well for transmitting, but it turned out that they did work pretty well for receiving. So we have a lot of trees here, and we ought to think about that. All right, so now here's a guy, Bert Osbourne. I knew his daughter, and he started about 1905. He was taking some traffic in 1906 during the earthquake, and he was actually transmitting by 1908. And his last call sign was W6US, which is a pretty good call sign. And so here's Lee DeForest now. Lee DeForest is one of my favorite people, although a lot of people despise him. even at this late date, they still despise him. But he was very interested in this sort of thing. So he was responsible for putting a station into the Palace Hotel, which became PH for Palace Hotel, and then later KPH, which is still on the air. So this is PH in 1906, established by the DeForest Company, and it didn't have much traffic, actually. There weren't a lot of ships that had wireless in those. Some did, but very few did. But it mainly, a lot of people say it was a way to sell stock, and so you could put together a little demo station and you could sell enormous amounts of stock, and you could get paid, particularly if you were, Stanford White, the promoter, you could get paid enormous amounts of money for your efforts and dribble a little bit of money down to the engineers like DeForest, who nonetheless could still afford champagne and automobiles. All right, so now let's go back to Pacific Wireless. There's Cranky over there on the left, looking at some paper, I believe, and they're putting a giant Ruhmkorff coil together. It's a giant inductive coil to make a giant spark. And the idea is that they're going to set up a circuit to Honolulu. Now remember, there were cables to Honolulu. So you could send a signal to Honolulu, but it's going to cost you, probably that cable probably would have been about $250 a word in today's money. So the idea was to get a circuit into Honolulu and to undercut the cables and become rich as Croesus. So they got it up, actually. This is the staff. They put it up on Mount Tamalpais, and they had the towers up, and they had the guy lines up. And it doesn't show here, but there was a multi-wire vertical V antenna, which looks to have been modeled exactly on what Marconi succeeded in using to get across the Atlantic in 1901. Now, incidentally, later, if you want, anybody who wants one can have a copy of the off-print I did of an article I did about Marconi getting across the Atlantic in 1901. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but anyway, they're available. So Mount Tam has got this wonderful station up here. So what happened was, in December of 1906, it was still up after the earthquake. That's on the top of the mountain. There's no big deal about that. But in December of 1906, the towers were down. And a guy who later became very famous, who was the communications advisor to both President Truman and President Eisenhower, Hardin Pratt, his name was. He and his dad, he was a kid at the time, he and his dad went up to Mount Tamalpais to see what had happened. Well, what had happened is somebody had cut the guy wires. Yeah, squirrels, right. These guy wires, by the way, as near as I can tell, were made by the same company that made the cables for the San Francisco cable cars. So there was a lot of really strong cable available in the neighborhood, and it was used for these these purposes. Of course it was sabotage, and it was probably those sons of bitches at the Pacific Wireless, not at Pacific, but at United Wireless that did it, and they later went to jail for stock fraud, which they richly deserved. Now, I'll get to that. But now, what's happening in the world here? Well, Teddy Roosevelt is sending the Great White Fleet around. And now, what is the Great White Fleet doing? It's going around the world, and it has wireless, and it's communicating, and it's down in the Pacific Ocean off Mexico, and it can get signals into San Francisco. All right, so here's a San Diego amateur station, which is actually working that fleet. Now, in those days, a wireless operator was perfectly happy to get a signal from anybody. So the fact he was an amateur radio guy didn't make any difference. But this guy was quite pleased with himself to be able to work the fleet about 2,000 miles away. DeForest had radio telephones on this fleet, but the officers didn't like them. The officers didn't like wireless at all, because, especially the captains, because it meant they were no longer in charge of the ship. They could get a wireless from some, as far as they knew, shave-tailed Lieutenant J.G. in Washington that says, change course and go bombard Santa Cruz. They weren't really in favor of this kind of communications. They didn't like this wireless, and they didn't like this wireless telephone either. It worked, but they didn't like it. And so here's an officer. This is actually a guy in Washington demonstrating it. Well, anybody who knows anything about the Navy knows that the Navy is run by the chiefs. So here's Chief Petty Officer Minorati, and he is on the ship, on the Great White Fleet, and he comes to San Francisco. And one of the things that he really liked doing was taking gramophone records and playing them over the wireless telephone and whenever he'd get to port, because already you've got what we call an infrastructure at work here. Already you've got literally thousands of young men with crystal sets and other sorts of things listening to everything that they can listen to in what we call the radio frequency spectrum. Now, it's mostly also what we would call long wave these days, from about 20 kilohertz up to about, maybe 600 or 800 kilohertz, but that's what it is. And so Mariette comes into town in his ships, and he starts broadcasting music. Well, a lot of guys, they had the idea that there could be music on the air, in the ether, was pretty amazing. And they, wow, whoa, what is this, So he did this, and now I don't have any evidence that Doc Harold heard this, but this was widely publicized in 1908. And he did it in other ports too. Whenever he'd get into a port, he'd play records, and all the wireless guys loved him. Yeah, yeah, right. That was the DeForest arc transmitter. Now, I told you about that sabotage of the Pacific Wireless Mount Tamalpais towers. Well, there was more sabotage, okay? When the Great White Fleet came into San Francisco, the DeForest people wanted to get up a better antenna so they could communicate with the fleet, because don't forget that the fleet had DeForest equipment and this radio telephone. So they get up, the engineer was a guy by the name of Roscoe Kent. He wants to test the system with Mariette, and he gets up a really tall tower, because you basically needed a really good long wire up in the air, and sure enough, somebody cut it down. So that's very interesting. Somebody cut down the tower. DeForest did not get the publicity bonus he would have gotten for communicating with his own equipment and the Great White Fleet. All right, now, San Francisco newspapers were interested in this, so we had a Chronicle station called CH, and they wanted to take traffic from any ships with wireless so that they could create what's known as a shipping news. They could put in the newspaper who was coming in and where they would dock and things like that. Now, here's a guy by the name of Isbell, and I'll talk about him a lot. He worked for DeForest. He actually, he went to school with Lee DeForest in 1892. He became an operator for Lee DeForest. He went over to Scotland and set up Fessenden Station in Scotland in 1906. That tower fell down too. And then he came to San Francisco on a ship called the SS President with some wireless equipment, which was from the Massey Company. We got to San Francisco and he stayed. He didn't see any reason to keep sailing to wherever that ship was going. So he got to San Francisco and he starts working with the Massey Company to set up a shore-based station for these ships. Now, the first thing that happens when he gets there is he's in his hotel and somebody takes a shot at him. Now, it shattered his mirror. That's his mirror. I can't see if you guys can see this at all, but anyway, that's his mirror. The shot shatters his mirror. And it misses him. He's shaving, okay, literally. And it goes by and it hits the mirror, and it doesn't hit him. Well, Isbell was a very capable guy, and one of the things that he did was photography. So he took a picture of the shattered mirror, and a lot of other things. So then he starts with a lawsuit. He knows who did it. It was the United Wireless people who did it, because they were in all probability, they were the people who cut down the lines on the Pacific Wireless Station in 1906. In all probability, they were the people who cut down the tower that DeForest was trying to put up, and now they're literally shooting at the competitors. So here we are with Isbell getting shot at, and he's very clear about this. They tried to kill me. This is in his notes and what he was saying to people. They tried to kill me. And this is actually his notes. I did, and they tried to kill me. Tompkins died in prison. This was a little bit. This is about 1912 when he wrote these notes on a newspaper article about Tompkins, who was the United Wireless guy who died. So he called them liars, cutthroats, and thieves. They sued him, and it looked like he had said the truth, and so that lawsuit didn't go anywhere. He was a very capable guy, a kind of amazing guy. I got all these archives from his grandniece. So here's the wireless telegraph company, the United Wireless, and what they had little stamps. So the deal was you could buy a stamp, and then whenever you wanted to, you could go and put it on the telegram that you wanted to send, and it was just like a postage stamp, and then the telegram company would send it. They also gave them out as promotional to local officials and people that they wanted to sweet talk one way or the other, and so they had these wireless francs, they were called, and Marconi actually the telegraph companies had them well into the 19th century. Stamp collectors are very familiar with this sort of thing. So these were francs, and this was from the wireless companies. Now, the one on the right, as you look at your screen, this is 1910, and it's signed by Galbraith. The one on the left, as you look at your screen, is 1912, and it's not signed by anybody. It's the trustees in bankruptcy. So these wireless francs tell a very interesting part of the story. And this is a company that well deserved to be in bankruptcy, and probably most of these guys deserved to be in jail. And some of them did go to jail. When that company failed, Marconi, which was very active on the East Coast, picked it up. So then Marconi had a transcontinental reach. Now, Isbell is up there in Marin County, and there's a lot of cows and stuff up there, and he's putting KPH together, the big giant rotary spark system that ran almost 300,000 watts, 300 kilowatts up there. It was so loud it could be heard miles away, literally. And if you wonder, what about those poor guys on the light ship with that whistle going all the time? Imagine these operators up at KPH with this giant rock crusher going all the time. Now it's in a soundproof room, ho-ho. You can literally hear it miles away. But anyway, so he got around a bit. And one thing is that he met this extraordinarily beautiful young woman, Grace Hilliker, her name was. I can't tell from the photo, but from what Isbell's grandniece told me, and as a little girl, she knew Grace. Grace was your typical Irish redhead. And Isbell and Grace eloped. They ran away, and they got married. So here she is, and very, very happy, as you can see. I don't know if you can read it. Belle elopes with Marconi magnate. And he was a magnate, that's right. Okay, so what happened then? Federal Arc System came in, and this was Federal down in Palo Alto, the predecessor of Federal Telegraph and Telephone, ultimately the predecessor of ITT, which I think in some sense still exists. That was the first Silicon Valley garage. It was Doug Parham's garage. Many of you have heard of the Parham Foundation. He was the guy who tried to save all the old equipment for the future, and he did. And he also worked with Jensen and Pridham at Federal, and Jensen went on to found Magnavox. So the Federal Arc Beach Station was a very, very big station, and that arc was very powerful at the time, which was the equivalent to 100 kilowatts for a spark station. And everybody hated, parasitics and spurious emissions and things like that. But it did get out, and Federal set up its own system of shipping communications, rather. And those cables, and again, I don't know if you can see them on the screen, but all of those cables are San Francisco cable car cables. We had a lot of cables in this town, and that's what it looked like. And let me go back. They tried to set up a system to compete with landline Western Union, and it was actually reasonably successful. All right, so here's the guy, a very famous guy, LM, Larry Mallorin, who started out maybe 1903, became a supervisor, worked for Marconi well into the 1940s. I found out recently, Mallorin, the family, was an old San Francisco family because they were what's called Californios. They were the Spanish who had been in California before the gold rush. And he was quite an interesting guy, according to his operators. All right, now, Dick Johnstone was another guy. He was working KPH and struck by lightning. But he stayed in the business. He's in the Navy here. Now, you can't see it here, but down at the bottom right, this is inside KPH in 1919. At the bottom right, there's a holstered pistol. Well, what was that for? Well, skunks. But when there was labor trouble in 1912, they, Hardin Pratt had to go out with the pistol to find who was throwing rocks at the station. And it was an old friend of his, actually one of the earliest hams in San Francisco, Lazar's name was. And so they had a little discussion, but, because Pratt had the pistol, he prevailed in that particular discussion. All right, so that's what it looked like in 1912. And the earliest amateurs were started about, as I said, 1903, but they were organized by 1909. So here's a picture of wireless operators in 1909. They intercepted wireless communications between California and Avalon in Santa Catalina, and all sorts of political stuff was going by, and they published it. And they got in serious trouble for that. Now here's one of my favorite people. This is Kathleen Parkin. You will see from time to time Parkin wireless equipment. We have some in the archives, and we had some in the auction too, unfortunately. She was born in 1900, died in 1999, and she had a commercial and an amateur license in 1915. And this is the cover of, I think, Wireless Experimenter. So that's how we started. Now, I want to show you just a couple of things, but one of the things to keep in mind is that because of all of this activity that was going on, every young man in high school, or for that matter, junior high school, wanted to hear what was going on, wanted to learn the code. Part of what led to the foundation of the San Francisco Amateur Radio Club, which was then the San Francisco Radio Club, and it's back to the San Francisco Radio Club, was that these young men knew that if they learned enough through a club like this, they could get a commercial license and they could go to sea as wireless operators. And some of them did as early as age 16. If they passed the test, you know, the companies were desperate for operators, they were on board. And at one point, I don't remember which one it was right now, it might have been Hardin Pratt, but I'm not sure. He goes down to see Larry Malloran about getting a job as a wireless operator, and he's tested and he's, you know, splendid on the code and he knows his stuff. And the last thing Malloran says is, look, you can't wear short pants in this job. Go get long pants. Because everybody, all the kids in those days. So anyway, so the amateurs, they were, this was a way to get a job as a wireless operator in San Francisco, and it was very, very important. There was no other significant anything on the West Coast in those days. It was all San Francisco. So they were all over the place. There were hundreds of kids in clubs around 1910, 1911, 1912, and they're listening to everything. And then when they could get a little spark coil together, like this. Now this is actually a fairly sophisticated operation. But when they could get a little spark coil together like this, they could start transmitting. And they would try to get the biggest spark coil they could and get the fattest spark they could and the biggest antenna they could. And it drove the Navy nuts, as you can imagine, because they were all over the place doing all sorts of things. And in 1912, when the Titanic sank, there were stories about amateur radio operators interfering with the communications. Now, I don't know whether that was true or not, but there certainly were stories about it. And one of the results was the 1912 Radio Act that said amateurs can only operate from frequencies 200 meters and down. So that's 1,500 kilohertz up to, you know, 100 gigahertz. But that was it. So 1,500 kilohertz in those days was like 10 gigahertz to us today. You know, it just wasn't anything anybody ever did. No, it's not strictly speaking true. So a lot of amateurs shut down their stations. But a lot of them just continued, and they continued illegally to operate on the other frequencies. So by the time you get to, we're going into World War I, what you have is literally thousands and thousands of people, young men, all over the country, who have learned Morse code and who are listening on crystal sets. And I have, you know, I'm sure you've all seen little crystal sets. So that's all they needed. You know, that's all they needed. And they were making little things like this. This is totally homemade, and you can see it's got the usual oatmeal box here, and it's got all sorts of nice switches and things, and you can control a lot of inductance with this. But one of the things, say again? About 1917, 1916. This has got a telegraph key in the front. Why is that? Well, it's got a buzzer in here too. I don't know if you can see the buzzer. But what you could do with this, and I traced the circuit as well as I could, what you could do with this is you could do things. You could use the buzzer in the usual way, which is to find a sensitive spot on the galena crystal. And the buzzer was very helpful in that regard, because the galena crystal was not uniformly sensitive. But the other thing you could do with the right switch is you could send the buzzer up the antenna through your inductances here and your capacitance. And that would result in a small transmitter. And there were kids all over the country who were using buzzers to talk to their buddies across the street or down the street or whatever. So this, in effect, is an amateur radio transceiver from, I believe, before World War I. It's hard to pin it down, but from the internal construction, that's what it looks like. Now, another thing that people love to do is they use the buzzer in the headset? No, the buzzer was for transmitting. The headset was for listening. So what this is, your classic Quaker Oats round oat box that was used as the form for the inductor in a crystal set. Now, this actually works very well because, unlike those little tiny inductors that you saw in this other one here, the more width you've got here and the more wire you've got here, the better the coil is. It's got some, Q, yeah, right, exactly. You get a narrower, in other words, it helps you keep the stations apart. So these, nobody really understood that, and the people who built this generally didn't understand that sort of thing, but these were very popular. You got an oatmeal box, you got a bunch of wire, you find a galena crystal somewhere, iron pyrites would work, and you could build a crystal set. And this one is a classic instance. Mike actually put this in the Radio Boys or in the Herald video or whatnot, because this is what people did. So the reason I want to talk about this way is, again, to show that what was happening in wireless laid the foundation for what came in broadcasting after the First World War. In the First World War, the Navy and the Army needed wireless operators, and they couldn't train them that fast. So they called the amateurs in. And there were maybe, well, a fellow by the name of Tuska, who founded the amateur ARRL, was instrumental in this process of bringing the wireless operators in. And he said there were 5,000 to 6,000 who came in. They were already trained. They already knew what they were doing. And so you have these kids all over the place who are fooling around with wireless. You have 5,000 or 6,000 of these people are called into the Navy and the Army, and they spend World War I doing what they were doing in telecommunications, as we would say. And then they get out. So it's 1919. They can't transmit again until 1920, but they're very, very enthusiastic about this whole thing. So when people like David Sarnoff are thinking, maybe there's a business opportunity here for RCA. RCA was formed from American Marconi and GE and Westinghouse and whatnot. Maybe there's a business opportunity here. And he starts talking, I believe in 1921, about every home having a radio music box where we could send music into each home by radio. And he said he wrote this memo in 1916, but I don't believe that for a minute. But anyway, so, but the idea of the radio music box becomes very interesting because lots of amateurs were doing radio telephone. It was possible to send music. We've known that from 1908 with the Great White Fleet. Doc Harold was doing it all over in Northern California. So this, all of a sudden, there was this possibility after the First World War of having a kind of mass communications where there were stations that would cover 100 miles, 200 miles, or whatever. They could be linked by telephone. And they could broadcast maybe only, a couple hours a week or whatever. Local hotel is playing music. Now, I'm going to stop pretty soon, but one thing to keep in mind about broadcasting is that when it took off in the 1920s, started with crystal sets and then vacuum tube radios and all that sort of thing. When it took off in the 1920s, we were engaged in the great and noble experiment of prohibition, which meant technically you couldn't go down to the bar and have a drink. So one of the things that happened, and you will see this on the covers of some of the radio magazines of the day, is that people would invite their friends into their homes and they would listen to the radio. Well, what are they listening to? Well, on Saturday night, they're listening to the local hotel's orchestra, which is playing for the hotel people and also being broadcast. Now, why are these people going to the home, coming to somebody's home to listen to this? Well, because they couldn't get a drink down at the hotel because it was illegal. But you could serve anything you wanted in your own home as long as you'd gotten it, and believe me, you could get it. And so essentially people were coming for cocktail parties and dance parties listening to the radio. And Well, there was bathtub gin in those days too. Yeah. Well, good luck for that. But Scotch was much better, and you could get it through Smuggler's Cove over here. All right. So that's what I have to say about wireless. Now, anybody who wants one of these Marconi's Transatlantic Triumph is welcome to take one. And anybody who wants one of America's Wireless Spy, I wrote these for AWA, is welcome to take one. So I'm going to just put them over there by that radio. And with that, I will turn this back over to Mike.